I have one word, awesome.
Awesome.
I think before we started, Prem said, I want to have a bet to see how many times we're going to use the word awesome during the course of this panel. Yeah, about 12, right. So thank you so much. That really got our juices flowing. And I think that, you said you don't have a strategic plan, but any organization whose mission is to forward the interest of awesomeness in the universe, I think that really kind of says it all. And you gave us a lot of things in terms of food for thought about, what are some of the principles we can use to forward or kind of achieve scale. But before we get on discussing this in detail, I'd like to hear from some of our other panelists and tell us a little bit about how you're forwarding awesomeness within each one of your organizations. And so can we start off with Louise?
Sure. Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And first, I need to start with this. I mean, I've been in several panels, but this is the first time in a panel with such cool names for organizations. I mean, seriously, the Awesome Foundation. Seriously, man. That's just so cool. And then Continuum, Google. I mean, it makes Green Momentum sound like crap, man. Seriously. And I was very proud up until yesterday about this now, and I have to change it. So anyway, second, I think this is excellent. This was a fantastic Ignite talk. I mean, how do we top that? No, it's in what I do. I work with entrepreneurs in developing countries, mostly, well, solely in Latin America. I work mostly with Mexican entrepreneurs where there are several cultural barriers, where they have a lot of limitations, a lot of the time self-imposed, but a lot of the times real limitations, sometimes imposed by the institution, sometimes imposed by the corruption in the institutions, sometimes simply imposed because their parents told them that they had to go out and get the best job they could, but they never told them you should create a new job, you should change the world, you should do something different. So how do you, foster awesomeness? And how do you take these people to the next level? And that is a very, very difficult question to answer because the answer, in my experience, is not a single one. I mean, a lot of the time you need to look at the people's specific conditions, living conditions, and what their priorities are. Because, I mean, our offices are in New York. They used to be in Silicon Valley. And life was fantastic there. It was awesome. I used to have a house with a swimming pool and everything. And then I go to Oaxaca, and then I'm talking to a guy that doesn't have a toilet in his house and has never had one, and in his life has never flushed a toilet. And he has an idea how to better his community through entrepreneurship. And it's like, seriously, man? And what do you want to do? And you would think, I'm going to bring, a toilet to everybody's house. He's like, no, I have an idea on how to prepare tacos in a better way so I can sell it to all the tourists that come here. I was like, okay. And so you want to help this guy to succeed as an entrepreneur, you want to help this guy to do better things for his community, but at the same time you are, dude, wouldn't you want a toilet in your house? I mean, wouldn't you want to have sewer infrastructure or something like that? So a lot of the time when we work with people in Mexico, in Colombia, and in Latin America in general, we want to help them, but we want to help them fight things that they don't know they need to fight a lot of the time. I don't know if that helps. You look sad. Sorry. That wasn't my intention.
We're not sad, we're thinking.
Okay, yeah. Awesome.
Prem?
Sounds like both of you do really awesome things. I'm a product manager at Google. I have been there for since 2006. The two projects that I have worked on that might be of interest to this group. One was I worked in India on launching a bus that traveled to tier 2 and 3 cities to introduce people to the internet. We called it the Internet Bus Project. We should have called it the Awesome Internet Bus Project.
That's implied.
Yeah, and then the second one was I had the opportunity to help start Google.org's crisis response team, which tried to see how we could focus our technology in the aftermath of natural disasters and humanitarian crises. And it gave us a lot of opportunities to think about how we scale towards populations that are under duress, that might have issues accessing the very technologies that we wanted them to use to get to us.
Stephen?
Great, thank you for having me, and Kate, and to all the organizers for having us on this snowy day. So my name is Stephen Goodman. I work for Continuum Innovation. We are a 30-year-old design and innovation firm. We are global. We have offices around the world, Shanghai, Seoul, Los Angeles, and Milan. We do work much beyond those borders with clients on a range of issues. We have 3 lines of business where we focus on product design, something that's tangible. But of course, that's morphing more and more into things that are digital. Then we have a group called Service Strategy and Design, which is designing an experience or a process or a method that one would go through, both consumer and B2B. And then the last group, we have an Advanced Systems group, which is kind of it's the intersection of hard technology, complex systems, and human factors. But I think the thing that's important to know about the firm is that we're global, and we take a human factors design approach to solving problems. But I think the other important thing to share is that I'm here not just with that hat, but the reason why I'm at Continuum is because I see this convergence of scale. On one hand, what we're seeing is maturity in social enterprise and social innovation, where they're realizing that scale is part of the conversation now. At the same time, I think in more mature businesses, whether they're going after the global middle class or even they're using an open source technology model, even the proliferation of digital app technology, that those things actually are sharing, those realms are coming closer and closer together. And so for me, having in the past been exposed to some of those things at a design firm, I'm able to get another flavor of it. And this flavor is human-centered design.
Great. So now we have a better sense of what each one of our panelists actually does, and I'd like to kind of throw some questions back to all of you. We've been talking a lot about kind of scale. Keith, you mentioned that you have 89 chapters now in about 18 countries, and Kim mentioned this tension this morning about, scale. What does that actually mean? Does that mean going global or local? And I'd like to ask both Keith and Louise to tell us how you guys actually define scale, and what does this mean from both a financial and a social perspective?
Well, as it relates to the Awesome Foundation, scale is simply in our mission, right? More awesomeness in the universe. And it chose how to take its form. We didn't sort of direct scale as saying, hey, it's going to be more chapters, or hey, it's going to be more applications, or hey, it's going to be more actual grants. That is mostly how it's manifested. And I think in part that's due to the principles that I outlined, right? So these semi-autonomous groups of individuals coming together in the interest of awesome has become our sort of atomic unit. I wouldn't necessarily define scale strictly that way within other contexts, but within ours it makes a lot of sense and lets us look through that lens. And I think in general, having ways to look at scale is important. I know in a conversation we had briefly before the panel, the idea that, hopefully I'm not stealing anyone's thunder, but the idea that we often look sort of at aspects of scale in just singular dimensions rather than understandings of all the components. For example, some are variable costs, but there might be variable costs we don't understand around things like distribution. To be clear also, Awesome Foundation is a tremendous amount of fun, as you can imagine, and totally worth the investment. But it doesn't pay the bills. So I also, for the last 7 years, have done digital products for NPR in supporting our member stations, where scale is pretty different, right? We've got this distributed network of NPR stations around the United States that we think a lot about, and scale there is a little bit different.
Okay, great. Louise?
Well, I've had experiences with scaling at different levels. I work with entrepreneurs, and we do not classify ourselves as social entrepreneurs. We do not classify ourselves as impact investors either, because we believe that if you're going to be an entrepreneur, it has to have social component. If you're going to invest, it has to have some impact at the end of the day. But at the end of the day, what you're looking for is that social component. You want to clearly identify that. And you want to clearly identify the impact that you're going to have. So in terms of scaling, for example, when we work with entrepreneurs, there are two aspects. We want to help them scale their business. And a lot of the time, it is not necessarily that they want to go global. They just want to reach the audience they want to reach, and you want to make sure they can live of that, But at the same time, what we do, we work at the macroeconomic level also. We want to help countries like Mexico to do the transition to an innovation economy, for example. So how do we do that if we work with one entrepreneur at a time? So what we do is we identify what the local issues are that are also very easy to generalize. For example, in Mexico, we have a problem with water. Either there is no water at all in some places, or there is so much water they don't know what to do with it. So when we go to a community and we help entrepreneurs develop a solution for that particular problem, we're always looking for a way of scaling that solution so it can be applied in other places in the country. And that is one of the most difficult things that we have to do when we work with entrepreneurs in these places. Then there is the other aspect of scaling. And this was, it's a very interesting conversation that I had about a year ago with some people at the White House, that we were talking about how do we scale the impact that organizations like the Awesome Foundation, Green Momentum, and others are having on countries like, Latin America, for example. And how do you scale? And the discussion was centered all about money, Can we give you tons of money so you can do that? And of course I was like, dude, that sounds cool, but in places like that you need to sound like, So I went, for a while. But then in the process I realized that it wasn't about the money. It is so much about the people, it's about the partnership, it's about who do you work with, and making sure that the people you work with have the same objectives that you do. And so what we asked was for, help recruiting people that could think like us and could be genuinely interested in scaling other people's solutions to help, fix the problems the world faces today.
Okay, great. So I like the fact that you said, dude, that's cool, because I often want to be saying that inside, but I have to really kind of, check myself. So thank you for expressing that. So I want to switch gears a little bit and move over to Prem and Stephen, because, we heard a lot about scaling in the sense of providing grants, but also working with entrepreneurs. We talked about, the social component, people and partnerships. And I'm wondering, when you guys think about scale, more working with products, right? And specifically kind of technical products, do you think about scale in the same way? Where are there similarities and differences in terms of the way you define scale? And maybe when you're defining it, could you give us an example in both of your contexts where there's been a success, but also maybe a failure?
So I think I got the questions in advance of what do you consider to be scale. So I wrote down something that was basically the ability to grow an outcome at a rate faster than your resources. And so I think if you look at the words in that outcome, rate, and resources, those are up to you to define at the end of the day. So is the outcome related to a social venture? Is the outcome a financial metric? Is the outcome a user growth? Is the rate, 1 more? Is it 10 more? Is it 100 more? And then in terms of resources, are your resources that are limiting you, is it cost? Is it actually marketing? Is it people, operations, so on and so forth? And so if you view it in that light, I think, if you look at the projects that I've done at Google, or the products that I've been able to work with at Google, there are two examples that are very different in terms of scale there, right? So, we built one bus at the end of the day, which can only go to one place at one physical time. And so it doesn't scale, would be the argument. And that was the argument that was used by a lot of people internally as to why we should not do this project. But I think on the flip side, if you look at it, that one bus can travel to 150 different cities over the course of a few years, get local language press out in each of these areas, right? And I think the local language press ended up being some 650 articles in really localized, like these small, like tier 2 and 3 city sort of newspapers over like 3 days of, overall 3 days of TV coverage is what it ended up adding up to be if you added it all together. And so you look at that from that perspective, and the scale ended up allowing Google to have a brand presence in India, allowing the internet to, grow again when, India was kind of flatlining in internet penetration. That, along with many other things, mind you, helped push that back up. But I think what you saw was the opportunity to use what anybody would argue was a non-scalable platform to have scale nonetheless. So I think it depends on how you define what your scale is and how you plan on going about it. And failures, I can mention many, but I'll save you that.
You don't have to sign a non-disclosure. Stephen?
So I'll give you two different examples so you can conceptualize this, because I think it applies, what I'm going to talk about applies to both. You'll have, I think a lot of people here are squarely in the social innovation space. We are working with the World Bank. We are in a project of financial inclusion, primarily with women. Other work that I'm very deep in and is very fascinating is we're developing a medical device for diabetes care for the middle class in India, which is a large group or large segment. And, so the way I've thought about scale is that I think, the zeitgeist of practical ideas, I think, go in waves of 5 to 7 years. Maybe it's starting to be 2 or 3. But if you go back maybe, 10 to 14 years ago, we heard a lot about this idea of the good idea. And having had a lot of experience in Silicon Valley, they kind of geek out on that. Maybe too far. It's just, what's the good idea? But I think that as that's matured, people are realizing that a good idea is not enough, and you need some kind of model. And I think that aspect started people to realize that if they're going to pick a model, they need to do it for scale, and they do it for two reasons. Either they want impact, human impact, and it can be a social or a civic, or just a good use, or financial. And so I think now so for me, for scale, I think now where we're at is that scale is coming back to, and this word is easy to throw around, but impact. Again, financial impact and user impact. And if you go back to the financial inclusion work that we're doing with the World Bank, it's the same thing. The only way to really succeed in making this great idea, build a scalable model, and have impact is to think about kind of the user benefit and the financial benefit. And then also on the side of the diabetes medical device.
So I think what I've heard in common across all these groups is that, we need to look at the outcome or impact, which can be defined in different ways. You need to be looking at the rate and also the resources. I didn't know if, Kim, if you had a question, and then I was going to go on to Stephen. Go ahead.
Yeah, I do, which is, are you seeing any constraints, any obvious constraints? So, Keith, I hear about your business, and it's 89 chapters now, and all of them are awesome. Do you see any constraints to that? It looks like you have a digital platform and you have some very basic rules, but is it going to get to a point where it's not so awesome anymore?
That's a great question. Certainly something that comes up. There are already constraints that we face. For example, when your growth is dependent on a certain amount of autonomy in its formation, that obviously comes with decentralized decision-making, decentralized messaging, and this is in many ways fantastic because some of the principles we formed on was not trying to create strictures around that. But on the other hand, you could imagine futures in which, core ideas get diluted to the point at which they start losing their compelling nature, or maybe isolated bad things happen that reflect on the organization, or messages generate. We've had this challenge where some of our messages generate a lot of interest in applying for the foundation, but that people stop listening after you can get money, right? And maybe don't think about the kinds of things that our distributed organization is particularly interested in funding. So those things, there's some limitations certainly there. Those are the first things to jump to mind immediately.
And I'd be interested also, Luis, if you see constraints just built into your work, and if so, what are they?
Well, most of the constraints are cultural, and that is one of the problems that we face a lot of the time. I think, the financial aspects can be fixed a lot of the time. Capacity building, there are excellent programs for capacity building, confidence into people to do what they can do is more difficult task. I mean, a lot of the time working with guys, trying to tell them, your solution could change your community, your country, the entire planet. They go, yeah, sure, man, I'm going to go back to work now. So I think that's one of the most difficult things. I mean, we're Green Momentum. We started out as a green company focusing on environmental aspects, but now we use green as an umbrella term for social. When we go there, we just find that this cultural barrier that developing countries have.
It's really interesting.
Can I say something about constraints? Two separate thoughts. One is, when I think about constraints, go back to what I mentioned about ideas. I think a lot of good ideas are fun, but I think if you have to pick one idea, maybe not the perfect idea, a right idea, and that forces you to execute, that is quite good. But also I think on constraints, I don't know how many people are familiar with the whole concept of Jujat innovation and some of the concepts around the emerging markets that, again, it's been around for a while, but the idea is that people have to solve problems because they have limited resources. I'm a big fan of that because I think what it bumps into is this idea that, again, it's simplified, but this idea that, if you have enough constraints and if you have the passion and you really have a problem to solve, you will get it done. But I actually sometimes think it bumps into scale. But that's a larger conversation.
But I think even more than that, if you look at it, like there's a trend right now that, and I think this might be a Silicon Valley bubble issue, but I think it's farther than that. You're an ICT for D professor, right? And there's this belief that technology will cure all ills. And recently, I think Bill Gates gave a talk where he basically sneered at the idea that giving internet to the poor is suddenly going to alleviate their diseases, their issues around mortality rates, infant mortality rates, and things like that. You know, he said we need to build toilets, we need to solve malaria, we need to do things that are more important than just throwing technology at them. So I think in terms of constraints, you really need to understand the group of people, you know, talk through a failure for a bit. And I really believe in celebrating failure because I failed a lot more than succeeding, so it's more fun that way. But like in terms of a failure that we had as a team was when we initially formed, you know, we had this opportunity to help out after the Haiti earthquake. And so and then there was a Chile earthquake. And so, you know, there was one thing after another, and these were countries where there were a lot of people who had internet and so on and so forth. And then there were these floods in Pakistan, and we used the same playbook, right? And surprise, surprise, it was like crickets on the other end, you know, seeing how many people are using it. And we even got the product working on SMS and all these different platforms. But the fact is that you can't just take what you do. You have to understand the constraints of the local population. You can't just sit where you are. And
I mean, you're echoing what I agree. You're echoing what Luis is saying. Is it's, you know, culture could be a constraint, but culture is huge, right? And people's daily lives, how they shower, how they go to the bathroom, how they eat, how they use money, how they take care of their children. Again, for me right now, where I am is like the human-centered. I think is very, very, very compelling, and I think it touches on both of what the.
And I think, sorry, if I may, you have a prisoner's dilemma here. I mean, a lot of the time, the problem you have when you work with smaller communities is that they are used to way of life. They're used to, you know, the people who actually manage to make money out of something. They don't want to sacrifice that for the greater good. A lot of the time, those are the issues that we need to fix. I mean, in Mexico, we have a very specific project. We created a grassroots hard tech incubator to help a particular area of Mexico City with extreme poverty. We want to help them, but there's like 3 people who are making money out of the rest of the people being poor. So how do you go around that? It's just impossible. I mean, how do you convince people, you know, you give up just a little bit so everybody can be a lot better? But then that is the greatest constraint that we have when we want to scale up big projects. You know?
So I wanted to kind of jump back on this and say, you know, we were talking about if you have a good idea, that's not enough. You really need to take into consideration culture, all these other public goods factors. So if we think about Google and your products, I mean, obviously you have a lot of good ideas, but then how do you test that and iterate it and innovate it, you know, taking into consideration all of these different factors, number one. And then number two, as you're answering this, you know, does that also mean that we should think about bringing in the public sector, God forbid, in some of these areas, right, to help us think through, you know, some of these cultural factors that we might not necessarily always be focusing on from the outset? So maybe start off with Prem, and then if anyone else wants to jump in.
So on 2 separate questions there, I think. So on the Google specific side of the world, you know, I actually think the technology part of the scaling is the easy problem today. There are enough platforms and enough tools out there that if you're a guy in, you know, your mom's basement with a computer and a basic internet connection, that's enough to like create the next Snapchat, right?
Or a girl.
Yeah, or a girl. Yes, or a girl.
And so
the thing to me though is that there are a lot more things to scale, which is understanding the users, the use space, so on and so forth. But what's nice about having that level of being able to start up with such little startup costs is that you can fail very quickly. And so I actually honestly believe that you don't design initially for scale. I think initially you design where you try to design in a way that you can see whether you'll have experimental success by removing all the other constraints in the problem. So when you look at Google, when we launch a lot of our products, we launch them to other tech geeks, right? We're looking for people who are power users out there who can use our products, who will understand them, and then we figure out, okay, so this kind of worked. Now let's figure out how to make it more appropriate to the general population, and then usually we rewrite it for scale at that point. And so it is sort of a let 1,000 flowers bloom, and then, but it's also important to make sure like 900 of them are taken out back, right? And so you do need to be careful about that.
But I think, sorry, I'm just jumping in, you know, like. One of the things I wanted to say is that if we were to swap our names, I mean, like it would be as unpronounceable for the rest of the world as they are right now. Just saying it, Luis Ramaswamy or Crema Aguirre Torres. That'd be so complicated. I'm sorry, I just tend to think that way. Anyway, I agree with you. I think a lot of the time we do design without the objective of scaling up eventually, right? I mean, we just design things and we try them out. But a lot of the time, when we are developing a specific solution, for example, I mean, think about the population bomb and Norman Borlaug, right? I mean, if that guy didn't design with scale in mind, it would have never happened. I mean, we would have, died. And so, I mean, does it make sense? I think it is a question. I don't have the answer, but does it make sense to just design without scale in mind? I mean, can we do that?
Controversy on the panel.
I don't know if, sorry, I want to be careful in what I'm saying. I'm not saying that you completely throw scale out the window. I'm saying scaling technologically is the easy part. There are other parts of scaling that are much harder that I think people walk by much faster, right? This is the marketing and the distribution and things like that. I do think those are important to consider. But at the end of the day, if you sit there and you write up your 40-page business plan on exactly what you're going to do, the moment you finish writing it, it's officially out of date, right?
Yeah. I have another example that supports this point. I don't know how many in the room have heard of the concept, the realm of growth hacking, both on the technology development side and marketing. So growth hacking it's kind of a coined term. It grew up with a whole bunch of kind of young Turks in Silicon Valley who were able to use analytics, technology, and some kind of marketing principles to really use kind of a digital tools to quickly acquire customers. And there's a lot of really interesting thing in it. But the point of it is that they've spent so much time focusing on acquiring customers. And I think it makes your point is that digitally you could, and it doesn't have to happen in Silicon Valley, it happens all around the world. And the technology can scale quickly and then you get them. But they never talk about retention. Like they never, that whole realm where it came from does not take into effect of, again, the things we're talking about, a culture, the constraints. And so you have a lot of these amazing growth hacking stories, and most of them, if you look a year or 2 years down the line, they're back to where we want to be, failure so we can learn.
Yeah.
So I think we're going to open it back up to the audience, but let's get that started. So does anyone have any questions for our distinguished panel?
I love the word distinguished.
Say it again.
Sounds awesome.
It's
Awesome panel, I'm sorry, awesome.
If it's a Fletcher gathering or conference, I have a hypothesis that the audience is more distinguished than we are, so.
Hi, my question is for Mr. Aguirre Torres.
Could you stand up, please, and just say where you're coming from, say your name and say where you're coming from?
Hi, my name is Katrina Canyon. I'm a Master of Arts in Law and Diplomacy student at the Fletcher School. This is my first year. And my question is for Mr. Aguirre Torres. I was wondering if you could give us a chronology of your organization and the history of its growth.
Sure. I wasn't ready, but we started out in 2008. I mean, there was a transition in my life where I ended up being an environmentalist. But before, in a previous life, I was not. But anyway, starting in 2008, we founded Green Momentum in Silicon Valley, and we were focusing entirely on technology transfer from Silicon Valley to Latin America. We thought that technology could solve a lot of the issues that Latin America was facing. And we still believe that if we use technology and develop technology responsibly, we can fix a lot of those issues, and probably 80% of them, that would be a lot. But then when we started working with the Mexican government, we realized that there were a lot of impediments to bring clean tech to Latin America, one of them being that there was not a clean tech industry in Latin America. And this, it's kind of funny, but it tells you what it was like in 2008, not so long ago, 2008. We did a survey about clean tech in Latin America, and most people didn't know what clean tech was, so they were referring to dryers and washers and stuff like that for clean technology. So we realized that we had, a lot of work to do. This I have to say it because it really happened like that, and a lot of the time you just trip and fall onto an opportunity, and that's what happened to us. In 2008, the United Nations publishes a book called Green New Deal for the World. I don't know if anybody read it, but it was a very interesting, very long article where it was saying that countries like US and Japan had to help the world get out of the crisis by switching to a green economy. And it was great. But then it said things like countries like Mexico, Colombia, El Salvador need to wait and see. So I was offended as a Mexican citizen, and I called the United Nations. I was kind of drunk, but I called, and I asked for Dr. Achim Steiner, the Undersecretary of the United Nations, and he answered the phone, and I was like, crap, he answered. So I told him, what I was thinking, like, I think this sucks, man. I think you should think about us in a different way because we can do a lot of work. So he invited me to a meeting with the World Bank, the United Nations, and the US government to discuss this issue. I was very passionate when I told him first, and I swore a lot, I remember. But when I met with these people, I started the same kind of discourse. I started telling them, you should focus on these countries because we have a lot of work to do, blah, blah. And they were like, dude, you didn't understand. I mean, we're not going to do anything. You have to do it, and we'll help you. So I put together a program to help in developing the clean tech industry in a way that would also have a very clear social and environmental impact in these countries. And I sent it out, and they agreed to fund this project and provide technical assistance. So in 2010, we started this program to help Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, and Argentina to incorporate into the global green economy. And we are succeeding so far. We are doing, I believe, what is great work. Last year, I can count 800 people involved in this project. And it's still funded by the US government, by the United Nations and the World Bank. And the focus of my company right now is to identify talent, identify technology either being developed or that could be used in these countries in a different way, perhaps, fund the development of these companies, fund the development of these projects, and then eventually try to get both governments and large corporations involved in the development of these projects. The result has been fantastic in terms of job creation and stuff like that. So that's more or less what we do and how we got here.
While we're waiting, I actually have a question for Steve. As I was hearing Prem speak, it became very clear that we all think of Google as a huge innovator, and he's telling us their process of innovation. He starts out with insiders, and then they prototype it, and then they tweak it, and then they change it. And it occurred to me that you're doing consulting for the World Bank and financial services. Now, that is an industry that's known for being particularly uninnovative. It's in a sorry state when it comes to base of the pyramid. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, since you're working with them, have they outsourced their innovation to the degree where not only are they not going to scale, but they're not going to reach the markets that they're purporting to reach?
So they being the World Bank?
No, not the World Bank, the partners.
The partners, the financial institutions,
Right.
and it's not just and the telecommunications, the mobility carriers, because that whole ecosystem, financial services is as much a utility going through telcos, and here's our expert actually, and mobility. So, I think the World Bank is one way that they're getting exposed to it. I think that they, one of the things I think most of us know that the challenge of some of this is that these are a lot of very regulated industries. And so because of that, they are not always precluded from innovating, but just it's a cultural thing, and their business models too. And that regulation hinders that. But I think what they're realizing is that mobility, kind of a proxy for all things mobility, is now empowering a new class of customer, this base of the pyramid, this new paradigm. And whether they're making $2 a day or $200 a day, there's this economic paradigm they have to start paying attention to it. So, my faith is in these international organizations, in this case, the World Bank, and then the group within this called CCAP, which is dedicated specifically on financial services and inclusion, could be a really, really good tool. And if you don't know this group, you should get to know them because they are, they're actually not, they have a kind of an arm's length from the World Bank. They use their affiliation with the World Bank when they need it, and then they kind of stay away from it when they don't. Because I think they're doing their own thing, and they're doing some really incredible things. Not just because they're working with our firm, they're actually working with a lot of our peers, and their model is that we want to work with more than just one. And so, I don't know if I've answered your question, but what we've seen, in Africa and in India, Pakistan, and even outside of the work CGAP, I think these telcos are starting to realize that it's that economic paradigm, it's that power of getting more people. Thus, we have to innovate. They may not call it innovation, they might call it customer acquisition, but it's getting them to move.
Yeah, we have a question back there.
Hi, I'm Celeste LaRue. I'm a second-year Master's of International Business student at the Fletcher School. And my question goes to Mr. Ramaswamy's point about not necessarily designing for scale initially. And I was wondering, at what point is a product, an innovation, or even an organization kind of ready for scale? And if you could speak a bit about, both with Google and Continuum, perhaps indicators that you look at, and then how would you enter this next phase of the process?
So I think it really is a bad answer, but it depends. I think it really depends on the product and what you're looking for when you say scale. Like, what is the outcome you're looking for? But what we usually look for internally is an inflection point, right? We know when we launch something that you're gonna get users. It's just gonna happen, right? So you'll see a little uptick. And you were talking about growth hacking earlier. The thing which growth hacking sees is this terrible dip afterwards. And the question is, how far does that dip go? And then does it pick back up or not? And that's when you want to look at, all right, now do we rebuild the thing for scale or not, right? And I do think that that's kind of where you're looking at that curve as to whether you have something here that people really like, that you think you should scale. And I do think it's important to think about rebuilding the thing from scratch for scale at that point, right? Because it's probably put together with duct tape and things like that.
So I'll try to be contrarian. But I think your question's really good because I think you mentioned something about scale that's not said out loud that you're alluding to is that I think speed. Scale, sometimes there's speed. First to market. And that could be in the digital space because you can go so fast, or it could be in consumer packaged goods or cleaning products, right? Or healthcare. That you have to be first to win because the margins are so small. So let's try to think about this differently. We're working with financial institutions that are trying to capture high net worth individuals in China, so not base of the pyramid. And so, would we design something for scale right away there? I mean, the segment is quite large, but it's still distinct. And I would actually disagree, saying that I think that you need to understand your scale before you start prototyping. But as a believer of prototyping, the reason why you prototype is because there are variables that you bump into along the way. So I don't know how contrarian that is, but I'm trying to mix it up.
So yeah, if you don't mind, I'll push back a little. Maybe it's similar to Prem, but I'm also involved in helping support startups as part of Techstars, which is a global accelerator. And universally, the problem is not whether or not the product's going to or business is going to be able to scale. It is whether or not the product or business should even exist.
Yeah.
And it's overwhelmingly the case, particularly when you have engineers working on the project. Not to pick on engineers, I am an engineer, but typically what happens is there's this overwhelming desire to sort of get the architecture right and to ensure that that these plans are put in place. And it's got a name. It's called premature scaling, and it's prevalent. I think that the short answer to the question, from my perspective, is you know when you need to scale when it breaks. And that's what you do. And I realize it's a little different, and I might argue that it would depend on your initiative. But if the initiative is a high-risk, uncertain, new initiative, it's highly likely that it will need to be modified significantly before you truly are onto something that's worthy of scale.
I think that's the point, actually. Very well said, because I think there are things out there that you can't go minimal viable product. It just won't work, whether it's your segment, who's buying it, what it looks and feels like. But more and more, I think, Keith, Mr. Hooper, said it.
Hello, thank you. My name is Ana Valeria. I'm also second year from the program of International Business. This question goes for you, Luis. I'm also from Mexico, and I keep thinking about the Oaxaca example that you give. Because we are talking about scaling, but then I also think how is this in many countries, Mexico, Latin America, and I guess there's a lot of more, that the thinking is not in scale. The vision is very narrow. So what is, in your opinion, the steps that we should follow or countries should follow in order to actually adapt to this and start thinking about this innovation, like economy of innovation? Like, what would be the steps from your point of view?
Well, I think if we look at this from a strictly economic point of view, I mean, Mexico, Colombia, and all the Latin American countries are economies that have both factors and efficiency issues that need to be fixed before we can transition to the innovation economy. There are institutions that need to be strengthened. I mean, there are institutions that need to be redesigned entirely in all of these countries. In terms of efficiency, there are access to finance, for example, that has to be changed because of the way it is right now. I mean, things tend not to work. A lot of the problem with thinking globally is that, you know, it's very easy for a bunch of us who live in developed countries to think about them and say, like, man, why can't you think bigger? I mean, it's so easy. And mostly because we don't have to worry about, you know, a bunch of things like sewer infrastructure, for example, because we take it for granted. So when it's in the back of somebody's mind, I mean, the last thing they want to hear is how they go global. You know, the last thing they want to hear is that. So we need to fix those very specific issues that a lot of communities face, and we need to give them the confidence in the institutions that they have lost entirely a lot of the time. And once you do that, then you can start telling them, you know, innovation is going to change your life, technology is going to change your life, going global is going to make this product just what you want it to be. I mean, I think a lot of the problems come from the factors that have not been entirely fixed and the efficiency that has not been reached as yet in these countries. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think we have time for about one or two more questions.
Me again. This is for Mr. Hopper. Your program is, we were in another program, we were talking about scale free and the concept of having programs that don't require anything to keep moving. Would you consider your program a scale free program, or do you think it's more of a scalable program?
If I understand your definition of scale free being that it sort of grows organically, so it grows on its own, doesn't require sort of top-down or pre-thought structure in its sort of growth, then I think I would agree with you, with the exception that while we were certainly a little surprised on the outset about the sort of worldwide interest in wanting to give, we also recognized it was an idea that was strong enough to have adoption and have spread. So I think I would agree with you that it's scale-free in a sense that it doesn't require that sort of looking for efficiencies and creating an engine of growth and having sort of a top-down strategy for making it happen. But I would disagree in that it required, without some of the core principles, and I'm restating a little of what I said in my presentation, but without some of the core principles that made it an attractive proposition to be adopted by other people, it would have never happened, right? So I guess you could say, to make an analogy, which is probably a little too close to home, but Kickstarter, right? If you don't have other people with projects that are capable of crowdfunding, then a platform like that would never take off. If you have a commenting system doesn't work if people don't want to comment. So I think the idea of tapping into something that others are interested in and setting the right principles in place to allow it to magnify is required in order for it to magnify. So I guess it's scale-free, but it requires a set of thoughtful principles.
Thank you.
Last question. Hi, I'm Diego Ortiz. I'm a Fletcher student, second year, MALD, Master in Law. And building on the question of Ana and the answer of Luis, I have this idea. Yes, in Mexico we have to change and we have to fix a lot of the inefficiencies we have with the society. But at the same time, I'm thinking more about like letting the people be a little bit more free in thoughts, letting the people like expand their ideas to make solutions for their own communities, and then maybe what can be the role of the government is to follow on those ideas and support them. But I think I mean, if we wait until the government and the private sector change all these inefficiencies, we are going to wait a lot, I think. What do you think?
I agree with you. I think change has to come at the same time. I mean, right now, if you look at Mexico specifically, which is the example we're using right now, if you look at Mexico, it's moving forward in terms of, it's progressing in terms of competitiveness. If you look at the rate of change in terms of competitiveness, Mexico is one of the top 20 economies, right? So I think we're moving in that direction. However, I mean, there are changes that need to happen. I mean, infrastructure and institutions. I mean, that is just stopping Mexico from making the big leap. So until we fix that, we're not going to have anything, and people are going to work like crazy, and they're going to be terribly disappointed if those aspects don't change. No, they are changing, I believe.
Which then I think raises another question, which is then who's responsible for those infrastructure and institutions, and how can kind of our organizations work together with the public sector? But I think that that's another debate. So I want to bring it back to kind of the title of our session, which is basically getting the basics right, designing for scale. And I'd like to kind of end this with challenging each one of our panelists to list one basic that you think is necessary to design for scale. So let's start it off with Keith and come on down the line.
I'll be controversial just because why not? I do believe that a good idea is important. I completely get it that a good idea is not enough, but it's so easy to point to implementation and community and culture and all sorts of really critical aspects. However, I think the best ideas can navigate through those things, and they inspire the actual people who have to show up and be the startups or be the people on the ground to make it happen. And without an amazing idea, I think it's really, you're just swimming an uphill battle, mixing my metaphors.
I'm confused now.
Yeah, you too.
I don't know. I think people need to believe in what they're doing, but mostly I think the word that I would like to use in my line of work is empathy. If we have that, then things are going to be much easier.
Celebrating failure.
Even though you didn't share any of your failures.
I shared one. I shared one.
I think, being from a global design firm, I think there's a lot of allure and glamour of these firms. They feel good, they look good, they're fantastic people, but I don't think design in itself is what solves the problem. I think what's behind design, which is understanding the user, prototyping, and really understanding the context.
Okay, so thank you very much for an awesome panel and all of our awesome panelists. This has been really fascinating. Thank you all for your participation and your questions, and this is a great start to the day, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, that was great. Nicely done.